As we wait for the rest of Yellowstone Season 5 to release here in the summer, I've been low-key craving more Yellowstone content, so I decided to rewatch the show in its entirety. And when I went to Vudu, pulled up the very first episode of Yellowstone, and I realized that this episode, Daybreak, is a damn near perfect start to the Taylor Sheridan universe. This episode even opens with a unique and enticing hook that I've never really seen in any other TV series. When we start, the scene opens with the camera pointed towards the clouds. Then someone's hand comes into frame. A horse also enters the picture, and we can tell that the man is trying to comfort this horse. We find out who this man is, and it's none other than John Dutton, played by the Kevin motherfucking Costner. And he doesn't look to be in too good of shape either, as it seems he's been cut and has blood coming down from his head. Already we are hooked just by the first 30 seconds. We already have questions that we want to figure out, the main one being what happened. John Dutton is seen talking with his horse, and he tells her that this life is not fair and that she deserved better. The next shot shows us what the situation is and reveals to us why he's saying these words to this horse. And we are revealed some answers. It obviously looks like there was a car wreck, and John Dutton seems to have been carrying some horses. The wreck had caused her to break a leg and become trapped inside the wrecked horse trailer. It's quite gruesome, but you can't look away. With his revolver, he humanely puts down the horse, saying his final words to her that the best he can offer her is peace. What Taylor Sheridan does already is make you like John Dutton. You may not like the situation that he's in, but you immediately respect how he handles that said situation, because you can tell that John doesn't want to do this either. But it's better to end her suffering rather than try to save her and her ending up dead anyways, but suffering even more because of it. After putting her down, he goes to investigate and assess the situation. It's here that we can tell that John is a cowboy, a real cowboy. The semi-truck that he got in the accident with was carrying an excavator. John checks out the rig and is curious as to what this is here for. As he continues his investigation, he finds the driver of the truck still in the semi, but he has ultimately perished in the wreck. John finds out that the driver and the excavator he was carrying belonged to Paradise Valley Capital Development, who sets up to be the antagonist of Season 1. As police cars arrive, John waits and leans up against the fence, watching cows to whom he says,
"Things we lose to keep you fed."
I love this line because it encapsulates everything this show and this entire universe that Taylor Sheridan has created is really about. Even if you look to the spin-offs, 1883 and 1923, the Dutton family has sacrificed a ton in the name of the ranch. Next, we are introduced to the black sheep of the family. But when we started the show, none of us really knew the impact that Jaime was going to have. And although Jaime takes a role in what seemingly is the Duttons' downfall, in the beginning, Jaime was just trying to do his best for the ranch. Speaking to the commission in the Montana Capitol building, he argues that land preservation and property rights take precedence over public expansion, making his position clear against a housing development that would take up part of the Dutton Ranch. The chairwoman of the commission, Governor Perry, states that the plaintiff must show public need, not just public desire. She dismisses the case, and as they walk away from each other, the plaintiff approaches Jaime, stating that it's only 30,000 acres of land, which is a very small amount of the ranch. To give you an idea of what the size of this ranch is, later in the episode, Chief Thomas Rainwater compares the Dutton Ranch to the size of Rhode Island, which is roughly 776,900 acres, but it's speculated that the ranch is probably more like 776,000 acres. So 30,000 acres would barely put a dent in the ranch. But John Dutton is of the belief that once you give a little, they will soon give you an offer that you can't say no to. And me, personally, I respect it. But we don't really care if they lose the ranch or not. At least, not yet. I said it in my 1923 review that Taylor Sheridan shows the beauty of the Dutton Ranch that the characters see. We see it through James's eyes as he holds his dying daughter, through Jacob's as he works to fight off the people who are trying to take it from him and his family. And he allows us to see it through John's eyes as he embraces his dying father for the last time. Taylor Sheridan uses likable characters for us to view the beauty of the ranch, which in turn makes us care for what they are fighting for. If Taylor Sheridan wasn't ever successful in getting us to like these characters, then we would never care for their way of life and the land that they are trying so desperately to hold on to. Then we get introduced to another Dutton, named Kayce. Kayce is attempting to get some horses out of an area that is actively being drilled for oil. The oil drillers from Isle Energy don't believe that he'll be able to wrangle these wild horses on his own, but I don't think that they know who they hired. He says that he doesn't need to wrangle them all up, just the stallion, and if he can do that, the rest will follow. Kayce begins his mission of catching this stallion, and the drillers think that Kayce is crazy, and they also state that they found him through his ad in the Yellow Pages indicating he works with problem horses. He does eventually catch a stallion when the next time we see him, he has him in his trailer. He decides to harbor the stallion in his corral for the time being while he finds a new home for him. I think this was an interesting way of introducing us to Kayce. It gives us a little insight into who Kayce is. One, he's good with horses, and two, he's a cool guy, he's a cool character. But a few questions pop up as this episode continues. First, we start to ask ourselves why Kayce and his father John have such a rocky and weird relationship. And by the end of the episode, that question fattens because it's revealed to us that Kayce has a Yellowstone brand on his chest, which segues nicely into the next bit that we are introduced to, the Yellowstone brand. While John Dutton is at a livestock convention, he is approached by Dirk Herdstrom. He asks John to take in Jimmy and raise him into a man. John declines and says that his ranch is in need of cowboys, not criminals. Dirk begins to plead with John. Being how they're old friends, John agrees, but he's going to do it his way, and only his way. Then it cuts to a man dressed in black stepping up to a trailer house. This man is none other than Rip Wheeler. He knocks on the door to find a Jimmy Herdstrom, one of my personal favorite characters in the entire series. But in this episode, this is Jimmy at his lowest. Rip punches him and ties him up and uses his stove to heat up a branding iron. He walks over to Jimmy, about to brand him, and Jimmy starts to freak out a little bit. He asks Rip why does John Dutton even care about someone like him. Rip says he doesn't, and he unbuttons the top of his shirt to reveal the brand that he has on his chest. As he looks at Jimmy, he says, "But he will," implying to Jimmy that he can become someone like Rip, someone who has John's utmost respect. Rip tells him that if he doesn't want the brand, he'll just take him down to the sheriff's office and he can deal with him. Or Jimmy can take a gamble and choose the suffering that he will feel now so that his future self may live a better life. And Jimmy thinks about it for a split second and agrees to go with the branding and become a member of the Dutton Ranch. The symbolic gesture of the brand and the scar that it leaves on Jimmy is so interesting to me. Jimmy goes on to have one of the best character developments in the entire show, and I think one could argue that he has the best development in the entire show. If you've watched Yellowstone through its entirety, then you know that Jimmy becomes something far greater than just a cowboy. But in this episode, it's the split-second decision that allows all the pieces to fall for him. And although he makes the decision that dramatically changes his life for the better, it doesn't mean that his growth was a straight shot with it never going down, because I'm sure that most of you know that that's not how growth actually works. There's ups and then there's downs. Even though Jimmy starts the show a complete Jeffrey, by the end he becomes a strong man and an even stronger character. The reason why the brand is so interesting is because the brand is only worn by those who are willing to see the end of the ranch. They are indebted to John and the ranch until the debt is fully paid. What does this mean for Kayce? Well, that's a topic for another day. The next main Nexus event character that we are introduced to is Beth. We are brought to Salt Lake City, and Beth Dutton works at one of the most powerful banks in Montana, and she is a cutthroat executive. Her bank is the largest competitor of Isle Energy. After 3 hours of negotiations, she tells the founder of Isle Energy that she will either force them into bankruptcy or Isle Energy must suspend the dividend and allow the bank to assume management. Beth presents herself to be ruthless and harsh, and willing to do whatever it takes to protect the ranch. Maybe not just the ranch, but doing whatever it takes for success. Of course, Beth at first is shown to be this strong female character. She comes with her set of flaws. At times, she can be the most unlikable character, but it's in the tender and small moments in the show when she's able to let her guard down and be vulnerable is when she really shines. And as the show continues, you begin to understand why she has such a hard exterior. I don't think I need to explain how much Beth is willing to sacrifice for the Dutton Ranch and its legacy. Pretty soon we get to the juice of this episode. Some of the Dutton's cattle cross over onto reservation land. I don't know how realistic this part of the plot is, but because the cattle have crossed into res land, the cattle become owned by the Native Americans. This whole conflict is what really brings Chief Thomas Rainwater and John Dutton together, for better or for worse. Thomas Rainwater's intentions with this are for politics, which seems really grimy and really despicable. And it is, but it's this conflict that officially sets off the trajectory of this show. Lee Dutton is in charge of taking care of this mess, and it doesn't go as planned. Lee is looked at as the one to take over the ranch when John Dutton dies. He's the prince to the Dutton Empire. The situation with the cattle gets hot really fast, with the Duttons attempting to move the cattle back onto their land at night. That doesn't go at all to plan, as Robert Long and some other natives wait for them to come. And as John flies the helicopter over, he starts shooting at him. With this being essentially a failed plan, he tells everyone to retreat. And out of nowhere, Kayce comes in and pushes the cattle back onto Dutton land. Lee takes them from Kayce and leads the cattle deeper into his land. And as he checks to make sure no one is following them, he says, "You want them back? Come get them." Then, seconds later, he is shot with a round to the side of his body. He falls off his horse and is approached by Robert Long, Kayce's brother-in-law, who tells Lee that he wants them back. Then Kayce comes in to save his brother, kicks Robert to the ground, and before he can get up, Kayce guns him down. And then he goes up to him and tells him that heaven doesn't exist, and delivers the final blow to kill him. Kayce races over to a mortally wounded Lee, but by the time he gets to Lee, he's already dead. Kayce breaks down over his brother's corpse. We come to the next day, and Kayce has Lee's body over the horse and delivers him to his father. John takes Lee to pick out a spot to bury him. He takes him and brings him to a tree where they take time to rest for a bit. This scene is an iconic one in the franchise because Taylor Sheridan decided to recreate it almost 4 years later in the Yellowstone prequel spin-off series, 1883. In our final moments with Elsa Dutton, she and James Dutton, her father, are slumped on a tree on the land that would later become the Dutton Ranch. It's interesting to me because 1883 ends the exact same way that Yellowstone begins, making this scene a symbolic nexus point within the entire franchise. Even when John is holding Lee's corpse in this scene, he still manages to hold it together. At Lee's funeral, as a priest reads the obituary for Lee, John reminisces over some of the previous Duttons who gave their life protecting the ranch. Some of the graves that we see are Ned and Chance Dutton. We still don't know who these characters are and what significance they have to the Dutton family, but my guess is that they were family members who also lost their life protecting the ranch. That's probably the most obvious answer. I don't know, maybe we'll see who these characters are in the spin-offs. That'd be really cool. After Lee has been put in the ground and as they all walk back for dinner, John stumbles across Kayce, who came to give John the stallion from the beginning of the episode. John and Kayce share a heart-to-heart, and John takes the stallion into one of the stalls. And in a moment to himself, John breaks down. A true moment of vulnerability that feels intimate because only we, the audience, see this. John doesn't ever cry in front of anybody else. Modern Hollywood might say this is a bad thing, but I actually think it's a good thing because he must stay strong, or at least visibly strong, around the people who are counting on him. I really love this scene. John has stayed strong throughout this entire episode, and in a moment to himself, he finally lets it all out because at the end of the day, John is human. He still lost a son, the son that was supposed to take over after him. In the next cut, Jaime and Beth wait for their father to get done talking to the governor. Jaime reflects on how John has never looked at him the way he has looked at Lee. Beth answers back and tells him that he never will, hinting to us that John definitely has favorites when it comes to his children, and Lee was probably the one. Then John speaks with Jaime and Beth. He tells them that he needs them now more than ever. Jaime says, "You have me," and Beth says that he just needs to tell her who to fight. And John says, "Everybody," implying that it's time for them to be prepared to lose everything for the ranch. And that concludes the first episode of Yellowstone. I believe this episode was a perfect start to the series for many different reasons. In an hour and 32 minutes, we are introduced to the Dutton Ranch and the family that has fought over 100 years to protect it. Without ever showing us directly what they've sacrificed, we know that this family has suffered many afflictions. This episode also does a great job introducing us to all the key players, notably John, Kayce, Jaime, and Beth Dutton, along with the main antagonist for Season 1, Dan Jenkins, and the semi-antagonist Chief Thomas Rainwater. I say semi-antagonist because there are times later in the show that Rainwater and John work together, and they even have a certain level of mutual respect for each other. There's also a really cool shot in this episode that symbolically represents John Dutton's fight against progress. About mid-episode, John and Dan speak with each other, with John being on the one side that looks like the prairie with sagebrush and wildflowers, and even John himself is on a horse, and Dan Jenkins being on a well-kept golf course. Lee's death really came out of nowhere for me when I first saw this episode, and I'm sure for many of you, it did too. His death really sets things in motions for this show. We even get a final moment with Lee, Kayce, Jaime, Kayce's son, Tate, where they all enjoy fishing together like they did in the good old days. We didn't know it yet, but this was probably the last time that the three brothers were truly at peace. Because after this, Kayce goes through hell and back, and Lee, well, he dies, and Jaime, let's just say his situation is complicated.
Please, 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 please.
This episode really set this show off to a great start, and to this day I'm still watching, and despite my problems I have with season 5, I still can't wait to see what the end of this show will look like. Okay y'all, that's all I have for you for today's video, and I hope you all certainly enjoyed it. Remember to follow God, protect your energy, stay focused, and until next time, peace!